Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Thank you for joining us today on this conversation. This summer, the United States Supreme Court, on a 5-4 decision, allowed an Obama-era program titled Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, to stand. The Daca Program was instituted by President Barack Obama on June 15, 2012, as a way to protect individuals who arrived in the United States as children without authorization. The program has been quite successful over these 8 years. Some 800,000 individuals have become beneficiaries of it. It allowed them to stay in the country and, of course, to go to school, to work, to join the military, and generally to live normal lives. From the very beginning, the Trump administration targeted this program for elimination, but it did so in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, a law that specifies the requirements to cancel a federal program. And that gave supporters of DACA an opportunity to appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's decision affirmed the administration's violation of the Administrative Procedures Act and thus allowed the program to stand for now. President Trump has promised to push ahead and try to cancel it the right way. So the fight for DACA beneficiaries does not end here. It simply begins again. To speak to the nature and characteristics of this program, the law and politics behind it, and the difference it has made to the beneficiaries of it, we have 3 panelists today. First, we will hear from Pamela Cruz, who is a research analyst at the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. And then I will also invite Charles Foster from Foster Global LLP, one of the most important firms on immigration in the country, and a man who has advised several presidents from both political parties on immigration reform. And then we will hear from Luz Garcini, who is an assistant professor at the Center for Research to Advance Community Health, REACH, at UT Health, San Antonio's Joe's R. and Teresa Lozano Long School of Medicine. Garcini, of course, is also a non-resident scholar at the Center for the United States and Mexico at Baker. For the dynamics of this event, we'll hear from the panelists for about 10 minutes each, and then after that, we will engage them in conversation. I encourage you to submit your questions under the chat feature. I will then collect those questions, and during the Q&A section, I will certainly ask the questions of the panelists. So let me call on Pamela Cruz first to give us her perspective. Pamela, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Tony. I am happy to be here. I hope that everyone is doing well this morning. So today I'm going to focus my remarks on the policy aspect of DACA. I'll talk briefly about its creation, where we are today, who these DACA recipients are, and highlight some of the valuable contributions DACA recipients make to our communities and the U.S. economy. There have been several legislative proposals that address undocumented youth. For example, the first version of the DREAM Act, which is the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, was introduced in 2001 and would have granted legal status to certain undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States as children. Over the last 19 years, at least 10 versions of the DREAM Act have been introduced in Congress, all failing to become law despite bipartisan support. In response to the failure of the legislation to pass on both sides of Congress, in 2012, the Obama administration and the then Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, issued a memorandum which issued a new immigration policy known as DACA. So very quickly, DACA does not provide permanent lawful status to applicants, but does offer 2 very important benefits. The first is the temporary suspension of deportation, and the second is the authorization to work in the United States. This, of course, is subject to renewal every 2 years. It is also important to mention other efforts. In November 2014, The Obama administration issued another memorandum to expand the eligibility of DACA program and establish a related but new program called the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans and Lawful Permanent Residents, the DAPA program, to provide similar temporary relief for removal. However, neither the DACA expansion or DAPA was implemented, and that was rescinded in 2017. DACA, however, as Tony mentioned, remains in place thanks to the Supreme Court decision. The court's decision comes after 3 years of uncertainty after the Trump administration announced the termination of DACA in 2017. Currently, we have about 649,000 active DACA recipients, and at the height of the program, there were nearly 800,000 documented individuals. And DACA recipients came to the United States from all over the world with about 150 different birth countries. And we know that approximately 80% of them were born in Mexico. The states with the largest DACA populations are California, Texas, New York, Florida, and Illinois, with almost 160,000 DACA recipients in Texas alone. There have been multiple studies that look at how DACA has improved the lives of undocumented young people, from being able to obtain driver's license, to get better jobs with better pay, increased educational attainment, higher social mobility, and better mental health. We also know that DACA recipients have spent a majority of their lives here in the United States and are deeply integrated into our communities. There is an estimated number of 256,000 US citizen children who have at least one parent who is a DACA recipient. Another thing that is really important to mention with these DACA recipients are the important fiscal and economic contributions to the economy. DACA enrolled and DACA eligible immigrants contribute about $2 billion each year in state and local taxes. That's including personal income, property, and sales tax. DACA eligible workers also contribute about $1.4 billion in federal taxes, $2 billion in Social Security taxes, and about $470 million in Medicare each year. And despite the overall economic, social, fiscal contributions of immigrants in the US, legislation has failed to provide a path to resolving the status of millions of undocumented immigrants living in the United States. Actions on a smaller scale, such as DACA, such as temporary protected status, or even deferred enforcement departure DED program, provide these valuable insights on how obtaining temporary deportation relief and, most importantly, employment authorization and how that can profoundly impact immigrants' lives. The coronavirus pandemic also highlights how important immigrants are to our workforce. There are thousands of DACA recipients in our workforce, and many of them have been classified as essential workers. There are over 27,000 DACA recipients that are healthcare workers. So it is evident that DACA has and continues to have significant positive impacts in the lives of DACA recipients, their families, and their communities. The Trump administration, of course, has signaled that they will continue with a more legally sound process to end DACA. And of course, it is counterproductive, it is harmful, and it is unjust that they continue to live with the incredible stress and uncertainty around their future immigration status and their work authorization. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your time. I am now going to pass the mic on to Charles.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to join you in such a distinguished panel. Thank you, Tony, for putting this together. As you indicated, this is a very important topic, and I'm glad to talk on it. So I'm going to talk about sort of the politics of it and where we are, the Supreme Court decision, which was a little bit of a surprise. Although, interestingly, I was speaking on another webinar about what the Supreme Court was going to do when the moderator interrupted and read me what the decision or summary of that decision. And I had thought either Gorsuch or Roberts, one or both of them could be the swing vote. And I had mentioned Roberts' decision where he had used this concept of a reliance interest in the prior Supreme Court decision regarding the census and whether or not it was possible to put on the census a new question regarding citizenship. And he felt in that particular case that the proponent for that had failed to state an adequate policy rationale. So this Supreme Court decision could have gone one of two ways. The Trump administration could have led on defending the president's rescission on the grounds that it was an illegal act, but instead they relied on policy. Interestingly, if they had relied on policy in a proper way, that could not have been reviewed. But Chief Justice Roberts found that they had failed to state, given the fact that there was a large class of individuals, as mentioned, over 700,000, that were relying upon the benefits of DACA and had come to, they had been here for years in reliance upon that there had to be a more substantive explanation as a policy rationale for rescinding same. And so as both the prior speakers indicated, this can be corrected. So I'd like to talk to you now about what might happen in that regard. In a sense, this is back to Judge Hennon's court, who made the original decision in joining DACA, granting a temporary injunction. In fact, he's already taken, almost immediately afterwards, he contacted all the parties asking them to file briefs as to their positions regarding the Supreme Court decision. So the good news for those of us who support DACA and all of the DACA beneficiaries is that DACA is still alive and well. And since it goes back to the inception, there's no reason why a CIS should not accept new applications and issue what we call advanced parole travel documents. But in the end, this is going to be up to the administration. And I've said recently in several different groups that I'm not, while the president's reaction was somewhat critical. In fact, he said in a tweet that he felt like the Supreme Court didn't like him. That was sort of an interesting reaction. I think overall they may not have been that unhappy with the Supreme Court decision. Why do I say that? One, it sort of points out, it's sort of a roadmap, at least for Chief Justice Roberts. If you want to rescind this, you can. You just have to dot your I's and cross your T's. And they can, there's no doubt they can do that. And I presume that they will take that action, but they have to, it will be challenged in court again, although it will be more difficult to challenge since there is a Supreme Court decision. And if they follow that decision, it will be less likely that there will be as many district court and appellate decisions upholding, agreeing to enjoin any future rescission. But why do I say that the administration, while they may take the steps to go ahead to rescind this, that they're not entirely unhappy? Because this would have been another big political problem for the administration. All of the polls show that a vast majority of the Americans support DACA relief, including a majority within the Republican Party, surprisingly. So for the president, this would have, if it had been immediately rescinded, it would have put the ball right back into his court as to how to enforce that, or back into the court of Congress. And we all know that Congress only deals with issues when they're forced to, and they prefer not to deal with issues right before an election. So I think there may have been a collective sigh of relief within the Republican leadership that they do not have to deal with this issue immediately. Now, given the fact that it's almost, I won't use the word almost, it's certain that the administration has, as any administration, has the authority to rescind an executive action of another period of time, be it a predecessor or their own executive action, if they do it right. And there's no doubt that they have the capacity of doing it right. Remember, we've had this experience. The original so-called Muslim ban was also found to be deficient. And they went back, corrected that, and then instituted the so-called travel ban. They got it right the second time, and it was upheld eventually by the Supreme Court. So what's going to happen right now, and I'm going to conclude with this, ultimately this is going to be a political, resolved politically, and there's 2 or 3 scenarios. I don't think it'll be resolved before the election. I don't think it's in the administration's interest to have that done. And so the election will decide which way we're going to go. Obviously, there's 2 possibilities. Vice President Biden will be elected, or President Trump will be reelected. If Vice President Biden is elected, then it's pretty clear what's going to happen. Nothing will happen until his inauguration, and then he'll be able to, through his own executive action, reestablish something very comparable to DACA, updating it, moving the date forward from June 15, 2007 to a more current date to include more possible DACA recipients. By the way, it was mentioned that over 700,000 beneficiaries, a large number of those live right here in Houston. It was estimated at one point that there would be more than 70,000 here and a lot more than 100,000 in the state of Texas altogether. So the President-elect Biden, or when inaugurated, President Biden would immediately reestablish a DACA by executive order, and then, depending upon the makeup of Congress, seek congressional relief. Clearly, DACA was meant to be a short stop measure, and we need legislative relief. And we'll see what what the makeup of Congress is. If the Democrats maintain the House and they gain the Senate, then there's a lot of room for optimism to have a full-fledged DREAM Act enacted that would include a so-called pathway to citizenship after so many years. 10 years is the given amount. In fact, that was established more or less when I worked for President George W. Bush on policy issues when we were looking at comprehensive immigration reform. And then that would lead to, after that stipulated period of time, the DACA or DREAM Act beneficiaries would be eligible to apply for permanent residency, become lawful permanent residency, and 5 years later, those who wish to could apply for citizenship. That's the so-called pathway to citizenship. But depending upon the makeup, and this will be my final point, of the Congress, if, for example, the Republicans maintain the majority in the Senate, even by a slim vote, then I think it's more realistic to have to quote former Congressman Luis Gutierrez, to stop the bleeding, to have a compromise solution. And the compromise is a legislative form of DACA. It would be a 2-year program that would be renewable. It would basically follow, you would update the entry point of view so that it wouldn't be June 15, 2007, but a more current date. And then that would be renewable every 2 years and so forth, but it wouldn't lead to anything. Now, why would that be a solution? Because for the Republic, if you're truly concerned about the beneficiaries, you would want to put them into a permanent legislative status. And if that could be done, if the only way to do that would be to give up the so-called pathway to citizenship, that's better than leaving them in the uncertain situation with DACA being simply based upon executive action. Remember, there will be another presidential election, and so that's why it would be better to do that. furthermore, as an immigration practitioner, what if you put those individuals into a legal status, it gives them more flexibility in terms of acquiring lawful permanent residency through other means, through a family relationship. If they have a bona fide marriage with a U.S. citizen, or if a parent becomes a citizen, or through their employer. Once they have a permanent legislative solution, employers would be more likely to sponsor them under one of the employment preferences for lawful permanent residency. So it would be a much better, they would be in a much better position in that case to resolving their immigration issues. I could go on, but at this point, I'd like to turn the program over to Luz Garciani, who will sound speak. Luz?
Hi, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, Tony, and for Pam and Charles for giving us very, very good background to a very complex issue that has many, many layers. So Pam gave us some fascinating statistics to tell us who DACA recipients are. And, you know, during the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try to give more of a human face to it. So I have had the privilege of working with several undocumented communities on different settings and on different states for the past 15 years. And more closely, specifically with DACA recipients over the last 5 years, particularly since the announcement of the termination of DACA. I've seen them in the context of being my students, in the context of being my research participants, in the context of the provision of clinical services, you know, as mental health professionals, and now as partners. You know, we have partnered with big advocacy organizations such as United We Dream. So I have had an opportunity to learn more about their lives, to learn more about their challenges, to learn more about the strengths, and to kind of learn more about the needs. What are some of the things that we can do across interdisciplinary fields, from policy, from health sciences, for anthropology, from religious studies, to help make their lives better, given the current sociopolitical context and the state of uncertainty that we're currently living in addition of having a pandemic, you know, that seems to affect everyone, and a state of civil unrest. So before I move that, something that is important to mention is that two things that DACA recipients have in common is that they have arrived to the US prior to the age 16. So if we think about this, most of them to the United States as children or adolescents, right? They had no choice. They were brought either by the parents or by the loved ones, or they were sent. Many of them came alone. They have lived in the United States since 2007. So as Pam mentioned, you know, they have lived in the United States most of their lives. This is the country. And it is very interesting because when you talk to them, most of them speak better English than they do Spanish or their other languages, their maternal or paternal languages. In the case of DACA recipients who have immigrated from Asian countries. You know, and to me, that's a huge message that English is their primary language. They're highly acculturated, and they see themselves as American, but they live in this contradictory state where they are not perceived as that by the current sociopolitical status. So in short, most DACA recipients have graduated from school, have embarked in careers, and some have started families. And I wanted, when I talk about that context, you know, I'm going to tell you that the majority of whom I met, they're very inspired young people. Many have fought so hard to be role models for their families, role models for the institutions that they serve, role models at the jobs and employments that they do. They're very strong and determined people. They have a strong desire to learn because they understand DACA gave them an access to education, to work, to opportunity. They understand that is their platform to make a change. So they're very dedicated to any opportunity that comes their way. They like to dream, and they like to dream big. Many dream of making important contributions to change society, particularly those that would lead to social change, because they're living with it. They have a high sense of responsibility, not only for themselves, but also for the families and the communities that they live in. Many have been adults since they were kids, because given that they became highly acculturated and they dominated the English language since they were little, many of them have been cultural and language brokers for their families and their loved ones. And many have been able to achieve better jobs than even their parents did. And, if you can think of what that does during the current context of our pandemic, when many, parents have lost their jobs, they continue to be the ones at the forefront. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure on these young people. They have a strong love for their families, a strong commitment for that, which is, I think, one of the heartbreaking things about the Daca decision. And I heard from many, I was on several community calls the day that the Daca decision was announced. And some of the kids were saying, how come I don't find the joy that I thought I was going to find with this decision? And many said it was when my parents came and says, you won. The only thing I can say is I haven't, because you don't. You continue to be undocumented. And the parents were saying we don't matter. And that must be very heartbreaking, for a family to live in these mixed status families where some have privilege and maybe a sense of security, but when you know that the rest of your family doesn't. So this is a major, major stressor that continues to make this kind of victory still a bittersweet struggle, because the fight is not over. The other thing is that many are stellar students and professionals who they do a lot with very little resources. They have learned to maximize the resources to make contributions to society. They're very motivated. And yet, despite all of this, they face chronic and complex stress. So it is important to emphasize this stress because, as you know, no matter how resilient a person can be, when you're living on the chronic stress, your body will have the effects. And I think this is one of my worries with these young people, that they're very driven, but many were saying, we feel tired. In some of a recent research study that I did right after the announcement of the termination of DACA with the DACA recipients, we found some alarming results. We found that 30% of DACA recipients were having thoughts of death or dying 2 weeks prior to the announcement of that decision. That's very concerning. And that's very concerning also for them, because it's not that they don't value their life. It's not that they don't want to leave. I think it comes from this sense of being exhausted and having to face this constant living in uncertainty while still having to prove themselves. The other thing that we saw on a recent study that we did is approximately 41% of DACA recipients reported clinical levels of trauma-related distress indicative of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a high percentage. That's almost half of them, with about a third of them reporting levels of trauma-related distress known to be associated with high suppression of the immune system. So we want to take this to a level and going beyond the skin, this is going to have consequences over the long term on their physical health and increase the risk for chronic diseases. But if we talk about the immune system, that's just exactly who's most at risk for COVID-19 at the moment. And I think because we tend to see them so strong and at the front lines and advocating and doing jobs and taking an enormous amount of pressure. Many of them go to school and work 2-3 jobs at the same time that they help their parents. There's a lot of stress in the back that needs to be addressed. And this is why it's important that we push advocacy to help them, that we start building resources to create workforces among legal experts, among medical providers, among psychologists, even among educational institutions as to how can we best meet their needs. So in terms of the current status, right, I talked about the bittersweet moment that they're living. And they understand very well what this means. This means that even though temporarily they can be deported, they continue to live in uncertainty. This continues to feed on the challenges they have in regards to the self-identity, in feeling trapped. You know, one of them recently asked me, how can I learn to live my life in 2-year intervals, which is the amount of time that they need to renew, you know, their permits, particularly when anything can happen. You know, now, you know, we can be denied again. This can be taken away. How do you learn to live like that? So I think there is a lot that we need to continue to learn from this population. There's definitely a lot that we can apply to our populations, but there is definitely action that need to be taken across different fields. So hopefully, you know, centers like this, like the Baker Institute, the work that you all do in different plans can give us a platform to come with a plan of action to support them, because by no means this is a time to turn around and say, okay, we achieve a positive decision, it's the right path, then we can let go. I think they need us more now, more than ever. And I hope to continue to work and collaborate and know many, many more of you that are in the panels to see how can we achieve the change. And without that, I'm going to leave it for questions. So I'll turn it back to you, Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luz. Thank you, Charles, and thank you, Pam, for your presentations. It gives us enough material to begin a conversation. And we already have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask the first question for Charles. Is a political sciencey question, Charles, a little bit. Somebody asks us if DACA is in many ways a way for the presidency, rather, I think, to expand its power over Congress. I don't think that this is the argument the Trump administration presented before the Supreme Court, that it was encroaching, that Obama was encroaching on the power of the legislative branch. But there are some questions about the limits of the program itself and whether it invades the powers of the legislative branch.
Yeah, I think that does raise an interesting point, and that is it has been broadly said that both DACA and then the subsequent executive action of President Obama expanding DACA and adding DAPA, Deferred Action for Parental Accountability, was in fact unconstitutional, as you said, invading the legislative prerogative, that it should have been created legislatively. In fact, there is frequently, as the #1 exhibit, they quote President Obama saying that he, quote, "I cannot accomplish this through fiat, executive action." But that's really a misquote, because he was not talking about deferred action. He was talking about accomplishing comprehensive immigration reform. Deferred action actually is based upon a regulation that goes back to the mid-70s that we use regularly. The only difference in this case is the administration applied it to a large class of individuals. So I always felt that it would be very hard for the administration to argue that it was unconstitutional, that the president did not have the authority to do that, as almost certainly those proponents for DACA would quote the president himself, who says that as president, he can do anything he wants to do under the Constitution, and that he has such broad authority, in which he's used executive action, issued more executive orders than I think than any recent administration in history. So I think that's why they relied upon policy. Now they're in the awkward position of having to go back and start all over again, probably having to, as you indicated at the outset, to comply with the Administrative Procedures Act, which is going to take them time. But as I also indicated, that might not be all bad by the administration, because they might not actually want this issue to blow up right before the election, because I think they see that as a losing issue for them.
Great, thank you, Charles. And indeed, this is a question of the what some political scientists have called the Imperial Presidency. We do know that the historical trend in the 20th century in the United States has been an expansion of presidential power. But of course, there's always the Supreme Court to set the limits. and there's always political negotiation among the branches to restore some sort of equilibrium. So it is an important question. I think DACA puts it to the test in limited ways, but I think it's a way to test how much the president can do from his administrative authority, utilizing what is essentially a deferred enforcement of U.S. laws. So that's, I think, an important question. We have another question. I want to direct that one to Pam. There are some questions about the skills, the language skills, the education, and the ability of these DACA beneficiaries to contribute to the economy. FAIR, which is an anti-immigration organization, has published some numbers that look like they depress the value of these 750 to 800,000 beneficiaries. But there are also other studies that show that there are actually individuals who may possess a degree of schooling that is higher than the national average and so on. Pam, do you have any numbers that can help us clarify who these people are and what they bring in terms of their English skills, their education, and their ability to contribute to society at large?
Sure. So I've heard comments of that question, like the limited English proficiency that either undocumented immigrants have or DACA recipients have. And as far as, demographics, and this comes from this data comes from the New American Economy, but, you have to remember that despite all of the education barriers, income barriers, these kids have definitely, maximized their resources, like Luz said, and despite their challenges, moved on, even with, learning English as a second language. And according to the New American Economy, more than 1 in 10 only speak English, and over 90% say they speak English well or better. And you have to remember that the vast majority of DACA eligible people speak another language. In addition to English, this includes Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, French, the list goes on. So I would think twice as to only judge by someone's proficiency in English because they're here, they have lived the majority of their lives in the United States, and they keep on improving themselves, and DACA certainly provides that opportunity.
Great. And Luz, I have a question for you. Can you describe for us what is the life of a DACA beneficiary like in terms of their health, their psychological health, their daily lives? Like you mentioned, they live on a horizon of 2 years, and then they have to reapply and reapply and reapply. And in fact, this is one of the major criticisms from the left of the DACA program, that it doesn't really put them, as Charles mentioned, on a path to permanent residency or citizenship. It just simply keeps moving the carrot forward every 2 years for them to sort of keep applying, but it doesn't guarantee them absolutely anything. And of course, there can always come a president like Trump and try to remove that program, and that is a lot of stress. I mean, I've known a few DACA recipients, and these past few months, as they were waiting for the Supreme Court decision, I perceived the stress. Can you describe that a little bit? And also another question I'll tag onto that. Can you list a couple of the studies that you referenced in your conversation?
Absolutely. So first, I think I would like to follow up on what Pam was talking about as to where people can find the information. And I would say reach out. Any major university within the United States has a DACA recipient group. And all it takes for you is to listen to them. Request an interview with one of them and see how they think, how they talk, how they conceptualize life. And it's very hard after listening to their stories to not think of them as a desirable component for the United States. Many of them speak impeccable English, much, much better than probably mine with my accent, you know. So I would say, I think before making any judgment, I think they deserve a chance to be heard. In terms of their life, it's very interesting. I would see this amalgamation between ups and downs, right? They are very task oriented. So many of them are involved, not in one thing, but in many things, which is also of concern, right? Because a lot of them don't sleep. They work multiple jobs. They go to school. So they don't have the luxury to do one or the other many times, you know. They don't sit and wait for things to be given to them. They go out and seek out opportunities. You know, I have many of them that when they find out the nature of the research that I do, they reach out to me and say, how can I do it? You know, how can I be part of your team? And they accommodate. So they have definitely that resourcefulness and creativity and resilience to come afloat. But I think on the back, when it's time to go home and sit down, and that's when the stress hits, just in the same way as it will hit any of us. If you're, I mean, just think about it. What has the COVID pandemic done to all of us now that we're living in this state of uncertainty and mental health distress is increasing across the entire population? This is nothing new to this population. They have lived in uncertainty since they came to the United States. And this has become even bigger since the Trump announced the possible termination of this. So this is their daily bread. And yet they are able to manage it. But I think that the concern is if we don't pay attention to it now, we're going to see long-term effects on their health. And I think, you know, one of the beautiful things about this country is to stand for the protection of human rights and social justice. So we need to figure out ways as to how to protect this population from continually burning themselves up to the point that it can backfire. An additional thing that I would say is that many of them have made fantastic contributions. They have written phenomenal academic pieces. They're in the workforce. Many of them, I mean, I was reading the numbers, I think more than 10,000 have become self-employed and started their own business. If we don't keep them, other countries will. You know, and one of the things that they were asking me not too long ago in some of my recent focus groups, they were like, we're tired of living in limbo. We need to start to think about a plan B. And I said, well, what does that look like? And it's like, we're going to start looking for countries that wants us. We have an education, you know, we have a desire to work. Who wants us? And I'm thinking, what are we doing? You know, we're letting go of this already educated population that, you know, it's already, we invested in them. And unfortunately, with the middle of the pandemic, that's a little hard to do right now, you know, because people can't go anywhere. So that's another layer of complication. In regards to the studies, there are several manuscripts that have been put out there, and I'll be glad to anyone, you know, who would like to send me their emails and forward it. But this one that I just mentioned recently is actually in the process of being published, and it's lessons learned from undocumented immigrants and from Daca recipients and their families. And I think is how to live in the midst of uncertainty and adversity with very little and still come afloat. So there's many lessons that we can learn from this population, but they need us and we need to take action, and that action needs to happen soon.
I'll come back to that, Luz, but I want to ask Charles another question. Charles, there are several questions about the kind of the meandering of the process for these DACA recipients through the legal system. Will they, is the program closed or is it open only for those that had already benefited from it? Can there be new applications? What are the requirements for this? And of course, does the Supreme Court decision enable additional applicants under the 2012 memo, or are there new requirements imposed temporarily by the Trump administration? Can you clarify those kind of ins and outs of the functioning, the legal functioning of the program today?
Okay, everything will be controlled by the June 15, 2012 executive memorandum. There would be no expansion of that or change in terms of the terms or conditions. So the best interpretation, we have to wait to see how this will be implemented by CIS. Initially, CIS put out some very political statements that sounded like they may have come from the White House more than from an agency like the CIS. But the program still exists. The CIS should be still accepting renewal applications. The real question is, since the Supreme Court effectively said to the administration, you did not accomplish what you thought you did by rescinding the executive order, it would appear that executive order is now controlling until it's set aside either by a court again or by the administration effectively doing so that's upheld by, if challenged in court by some future court. So if that's the case, then new applications would be accepted. The current applicants as well as new applicants would be eligible for what we call advanced parole, a travel document. And again, when I say new applicants, that would be that relatively small group of people, because you would imagine anyone that would have originally met the initial criteria, they would have already been motivated to have filed for DACA. But there will be a small percentage that never got around to it. Now they would still be, I think the best interpretation is that they would be eligible to do so, that CIS would have to take their application and they would be able to seek the benefits of DACA, which the primary benefit is not only a stay of deportation, but as indicated, eligibility for a employment authorization document, which in turn makes them eligible to obtain a restricted Social Security card.
Pam, I would like to ask you to speculate a little bit on the public policy and the politics behind it, because I think it's important to understand it. Obviously, the numbers have been going in the right direction, so-called the right direction, for a long time. The undocumented resident population in the country, according to most fact tanks, has actually decreased from 12.5 million to 10.7 million, 10.5 million, and so on. The DACA beneficiaries are, in many ways, an ideal type of immigrants. Like you mentioned, they're highly proficient in English. Many of them actually speak English better than their family's language. They're educated. They're working in the healthcare system. They've joined the military. They're teachers around the country, and so on. Why? I mean, this is like the ideal immigrant. It's already acculturated. It's already proficient in the language. It's already. What do you think is the politics behind this unwillingness to accept that if there is a desirable immigrant, this is it? These 800,000 would be at the very top of the preferences.
Thank you for your question, Tony. I just want to comment one thing on Charles's comment, is that most people that have not applied to the initial DACA application is because there's also challenges in financially. The application costs about $495. That is, and additionally every 2 years to renew. That is a substantial amount of money for some people. Also, they may be afraid with the current immigration environment to come forward and give their information to the immigration authorities. So those are two things that limit or have limited, DACA applicants. And going back to your question, Tony, for a second, just setting aside, partisan and political disagreements, the lack of legal status for undocumented immigrants just creates an inflexible barrier. It limits their potential to seek better market opportunities, higher salaries, and a better chance to provide for their families. This barrier also prevents them from potentially contributing more to the U.S. economy at a higher level. And in the absence of comprehensive immigration reform, of course, like programs like DACA, like TPS, like DED, could serve as politically feasible templates to deal with the status of undocumented residents if you expand those programs and expand the eligibility criteria. And, because the United States needs more innovative approaches to solve one of the greatest immigration challenges, which is the undocumented population here in the United States. And health crises such as the coronavirus pandemic just magnify how vulnerable this population is and how critically important it is to ensure their work authorization is as essential as their work here in the front lines of the pandemic response and the U.S. economy in general.
Charles, for now, the program stands as it is. Do you think that the political winds in the future may change? You've advised presidents from both the Republican and the Democratic parties on immigration reform. It hasn't happened in a long time. Several important efforts in 2003, 2004, 2007, and 2013, 14 have failed. Are the political winds enough now to change so that, or will they change in the future so that we can see a more comprehensive immigration reform that will absorb these programs like TPS, DACA, and others, and then regularize the status of these people? Or can we expect another decade or two of just limping along on this issue in the country?
I have predicted, I'm an optimist. I have predicted so many times that we would enact comprehensive immigration reform. I've worked on that in various stages for so many years, and it never seemed like we had the right combination in the White House, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate to get that done. Obviously, for reasons that we've all stated, getting something done for the DACA beneficiaries will be a lot easier. It was often said when comprehensive immigration reform passed that it was too complex. The Republican oppositions compared it to Obamacare, that no one knew what was in it. I really never agreed with that. I didn't think it was anywhere as complex as healthcare reform. But there was a saying that what we should do is break this up and take it one part of it at a time. The reason we didn't do that was they were going to save a legalization portion for last, and if that had happened, then there'd be no ability to trade off anything. So that's why it had to be comprehensive, dealing with all of the working parts. So my best guess is that DACA will come first, hopefully including the TPS beneficiaries. There's been pretty good support even on the Republican side. Senator Cornyn over the years and most recently has said made very favorable statements, even about a clean, simple DACA bill that would just deal with the DACA beneficiaries. Lindsey Graham, along with Senator Durbin of Illinois, they had their original DREAM Act. The problem going back a while was that the administration, it looked like for a while we were going to get a DACA in exchange for which the administration was going to get a significant amount of money for the president's wall. Schumer was sort of going to hold his nose and go along with what some referred to as an obscene amount of funding for the wall, $50 billion in exchange for a good DACA bill. But then the White House, which you could read as Stephen Miller, came back, interestingly, and added to their side. They said, wait a moment, we want something else, which was essentially the RAISE Act provisions that Senators Perdue and Cotton had proposed, slicing family immigration, the lottery program, and a few other things. And that was too much for the Democrats. So the real problem with getting is, if we go forward, will be, can we have a clean DACA bill? And my feeling is that would be a good way to go if the Republicans could support that, and then there was not some huge political backlash for them. Then it might be easier for them to take a bigger step to deal with a large undocumented population. I think the best bet for that, frankly, will be has clearly going to be after the election. And I'll end on this point of view. I was working on Hillary Clinton. She was going to introduce a comprehensive immigration bill in the first 100 days. And then as I watched the election returns, I was devastated like so many people, but I did think, well, I'm out of a job in time. I don't have to work on that one for a while. So depending upon the election returns, we know President Biden would follow in her footsteps, support a big comprehensive immigration bill. But even if Trump is elected, interestingly, there's still hope there, because at different times he's flirted with the idea of supporting comprehensive immigration reform. He's gone back and forth, but he has said something at times like he could support that. And the critical issue is he's never has had a reputation for being very loyal. So if he's reelected, and that's certainly a possibility, he could sort of not have to worry so much about his base, which has been Stephen Miller whispering in his ear, which has been the problem. Mr. President, you're going to lose your base if you do this. He may be willing to, he has such a big ego, to do something that President Obama and President George W. Bush couldn't, support a big base comprehensive immigration reform bill, so he could get credit for that. So that's an optimistic view.
Interestingly, we're going to be parsing out what the implications, the finer implications of the Supreme Court's ruling are. According to one of our readers, a study by the Cato Institute shows that perhaps the Supreme Court didn't just allow the program to stand, but it actually opened up the opportunity for an additional 130,000 new applicants. So it doesn't quite eliminate the new applicants, but we'll have to figure out what that exactly means. So this is still being the edges of the decision are obviously still being debated and interpreted. Luz, a couple of our viewers have a question. What can we do? We, citizens of the United States, what can we do? How can we become active in supporting this population if they and their situation?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Certainly a very popular question. And I would say the first thing is you're taking the first step, by listening to programs like this. You're already making a difference. So in terms of what to do more specifically, keep learning about DACA recipients, educate yourself, and pass this knowledge to others. Everybody needs to expand their knowledge as to what the current decision is and about who DACA recipients are and the challenges they face and the resilience that they have. And use every platform. Everybody has some sort of platform, whether it's academic, whether it's legal, whether it's in service provision, whether it's your own communities and even your homes. Use it to support their voices and to advocate for a fair resolution to the current status. Make contributions, any contribution that you can do. If you can write, if you can talk to the media, use your platform to debunk existing stereotypes that have damaged this population so much. If you have any sort of access to teaching, make sure that you build future professors, researchers, attorneys, service providers willing to meet the needs of this population, regardless, beyond race and skin. We need to come together to meet their needs. So make sure to start planting seeds across all the fields that you have. And the other one is become involved in supporting research, services, and advocacy efforts. You can join. There's so many wonderful advocacy organizations that there's always there's always help that is needed. Help us build workforces across interdisciplinary fields, as I mentioned before. Support funding efforts. Unfortunately, a lot of the research that we do with undocumented communities is banned from federal funding. So we need to reinvent other sources of funding. If you can provide any type of pro bono services, within whatever your field is, please do so. So I do believe that these are some of the early steps that everybody can take to make a difference.
Pamela, yeah, Charles, please.
I just like that was excellent. I was wondering what Luz would say. That's a lot more than I would have thought of, but I'd add one. From a political point of view, this is ultimately going to be a political decision. So when I talk to our congressional delegation, our senators, it's interesting. I won't quote him, but one of our well-known Republican members of our delegation once told me, he said, Charles, he said, you don't have to convince me. I agree with you 100%. You're right. He said, but I'll never vote your way because as soon as I do, I'm going to be primaried. And someone says, no matter what, however it's put together, it's amnesty. So what we have to do is convince our members of our delegation, our senators, that we got to contact them, write them, email them. I've had, I'll end on this. I've had senators say to me that when they count, they have a staffer. My son did that once for one of our senators. They will give them at the end of the day how many people have written on this issue for it or against it. And they will tell me that they say that's a very good point, but they'll say 90% of our comments are negative. They're against amnesty. So we also have to, when legislation comes up, we have to organize and send in comments supporting good immigration legislation as well.
Thank you, Pam. Very quickly, because we're about to wrap up, and I want to give you guys a couple of minutes to conclude your remarks. The coronavirus pandemic, we cannot ignore it. It's here, and it is affecting the labor markets. And obviously, a lot of these DACA recipients work as teachers, but especially in the healthcare sector. So they're very active on this. They're taking risks. They're, as Lou said, they're very gung-ho, and they're certainly out there in the front lines, and they're very accommodating, very willing to work. But President Trump has made the argument that in suspending the H-1B visas, for example, that American citizens should be hired first. What do you say about this particular argument that okay, there's a preference in the rankings of employability in the country? What do you think about where these recipients of the DACA program should be in this? It's more of a political calculation, it's a political equation, but where should they, do you think they should be?
So I feel all of these rapid changes in immigration and more restrictive policies are only going to hurt the U.S. economy. It's going to hurt, communities that have both legal and undocumented immigrants. In terms of DACA, Congress's failure to protect DACA permanently is, part of the broader failure to provide the needed changes in immigration law. And I feel it's the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty on what's going to happen within the next year or two and how the economy is going to recover. And immigration is going to play an essential role on that, because you cannot tell both undocumented immigrants and legal immigrants that they're essential, but their work authorization is not essential. That's not right. So
one of the contradictions that we have found that agricultural workers, both documented and undocumented, have been labeled essential, but not their work permit, and that is kind of a paradox of the coronavirus pandemic. So let's start closing up. Charles, any final thoughts that you might have to share with us?
Just briefly, just that last point that you made, Tony. I do think that this is pandemic because of the undocumented workforce working in agriculture and the distribution of foods and stuff like that, that they may be viewed also more sympathetically down the road. I think that might be a plus factor. The other thing is a comment I will make is I am concerned that the administration is using this pandemic crisis to achieve what they could not through legislation by continuing to restrict legal immigration across the board, both their April 22nd executive order and the more current one, really achieving what they could not do when they tried to do that by trading off with giving DACA beneficiaries a benefit in exchange for cutting legal immigration. Now they've done that, and I think it's going to stay in place through this election or beyond.
Thank you. Luz, any final word?
Yes, absolutely. So I echo definitely what Pam and Charles were talking about, but I would like to make an invitation to dialogue. We need to find a way to help reduce divisiveness in our country. Can we find a way to come to the middle? You know, I know there's the other side that is afraid of immigration, you know, and what that might look like. But I think we need to learn from history, and we need to learn from other countries that have done much better work. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, Europe has a long history of undocumented immigration. What have they done right? What have they done wrong? And how can we come to terms to promote a dialogue that stops hurting and creating more divisiveness in our country? And indeed, you know, we have witnessed through this pandemic that undocumented immigrants are essential to our economy and to our survival, but so are each of you, so are each of us. We are essential to better the lives and to protect the lives of the most vulnerable. So this is what America is all about. And I encourage you to continue to build in the best we can.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Luz, and thank you, Charles, for joining us today.
Thank you.
We conclude our conversation, and we will certainly have another one as the year progresses and President Trump takes further action on this matter, or after the election, when we will have perhaps a different path. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.